Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for being here with us. Welcome to the future of journalism, as this slide says. It's absolutely no pressure on us to deliver on the future of journalism, so we will. My name is Cristian Lupșa. I'm a journalist from Romania. I'm also the chair of the European Press Prize Preparatory Committee. But today I'm here mostly in my role as someone who believes deeply that we need to learn more and we need to learn better from the communities we cover, whether they're place-based or identity-based or interest-based. We just need to do a better job of learning from them. And that's why we are here. That is going to be our pitch for the future of journalism and how that intersects with community, and making sure that the journalism we do represents the people that we talk to, and then we listen to them without thinking they don't know what they want or just treating them as a user. And in order to answer these questions and tackle this subject, I have probably the best three people possible. And these wonderful folks who I'm just going to introduce were brought together by a project they worked on. So that's going to be our framework. And that project is called News for All, and it was a participatory research project done in Wales. And you learn about this project throughout the conversation, and it will frame part of our discussion, but we will try to extend the learnings they gathered from this project to your newsrooms, to your practice, to anything you are going to do. So I'm going to introduce the panelists here, and then we'll get going. So immediately to my left is Amira, who is, until recently, she was a master's student at the University of Cardiff, and she's also a poet and an activist. Next to Amira is Rhiannon, who is a co-founder and co-director of Commonwealth, which is a site-specific political theater company. So you can already see that community-led design starts with citizens, or soon-to-be working journalists maybe, but also citizens. And then to Rhiannon's left is Shirish Kulkarni, who's an experienced journalist and community organizer, who you might have seen in other conferences talking about engagement or how we make journalism a more inclusive industry, which is a whole other issue that we might get a little bit into that today. And I'm going to start with you, Shirish, and ask you, what was the starting point of this project that brought the three of you together? And it's a project that the BBC commissioned. So what brought you together, and what were the questions you were trying to answer doing it?
Yeah, thanks, Christian, and thanks mainly to IMED for letting us on a stage without having AI in the title of our panel, because let me tell you, it is very, very difficult to do that these days. But actually, in a way, that's one of the reasons we've called this panel The Future of Journalism, because lots of people think AI is the future of journalism, right? And it's like, is it though? Because this is about human beings. And actually the really smart people talking about AI here are actually asking the same questions as we are. Because you will have heard over and over again, brilliant people like Phoebe Connolly from the Washington Post saying, figure out what the problem is before you decide on what the solution is. And a big part of that is actually engaging citizens in the process, right? How many times have you seen citizens on stage at a journalism conference? Like never, right? Pretty much never. And so when we talk about the problem, this was a collaboration between the BBC and Media Cymru, who are sort of a part of Cardiff University. And the idea was to look at what the problem is. And for the BBC, the problem is, as Lara from the Creative Diversity team at the BBC said yesterday, 40% of people in the UK are often not engaging with BBC News. So that's a problem. 50% of people in the UK don't feel represented by BBC News. And I'm going to suggest that the Venn diagram of those two things is pretty similar, right? So that's a problem. And if you're a license fee funded public service broadcaster, then your job and their stated aim is what's called value for all, because clearly you have to provide value to everyone, and clearly you are failing if roughly 50% of people don't feel represented, roughly 50% of people, give or take, aren't engaging with the news. So that's the problem we're trying to explore. And someone said to me once, but how do we understand what these people want and need from journalism? I was like, well, there's an easy answer and there's a sort of complicated answer. The easy answer is you ask them, right? Pretty obvious. But the trickier bit is who you ask, what you ask, and how you ask it. And like, I want to say, I never regard myself as an expert in this stuff. I just go into work every day and try something new. Because if what we've been doing for the last 50 years was working, fine, carry on doing what you're doing. But we're in a big old existential mess, so let's try something different. And so that's what we try different by doing community-led design, bringing citizens into the process and leading the process, and working from there.
So we will get to the what we ask and the who we ask and how we ask soon. But before that, since we do have Amira and Rhiannon here, I would like us to take a step back, and I would like to ask you, as in your role as citizens, what has your relationship to journalism been? Like, what has journalism looked like if it's been done to you or your community or your group? So maybe, Amira, you could share some of your experience of what was it like on the other end of journalism, and then maybe Rhiannon, and then maybe we'll get to how the project was done.
Thank you, Christian. Yeah, I'd say my relationship to journalism has been quite an interesting one, in the sense of, everyone looks to journalists for information and stories, and growing up in a South Asian household, my parents are very involved in the news and the media and how it will impact them and the lives of their children and, our communities and things like that. So it's always been an integral part of my life since I was a child. But I think where the complication is the representation and the yearning for the positive or the accurate representation. And I think that's where it started to feel like quite hurtful, in the sense of I saw my parents constantly hoping, maybe they'll represent us in this way. Maybe they won't use these words anymore. Maybe we'll kind of move away from certain stereotypes and labels. And that just never seemed to happen. And growing up, as a young person, experiencing certain things because of the way that the media have connected certain things to your identity and your appearance and your clothing and things like that, it makes it really difficult to comfortably identify with what you visibly look like. And I think another little struggle that I experience, and a lot of people in my community experience, is being British and then also being of a different culture, so South Asian or Arab or wherever you're from, and then also from a working class background, and then additionally being visibly Muslim because I wear a headscarf. There's so many things that come with that, so trying to blend them together is quite difficult anyways. But I think it doesn't help that journalism and the media together, creating associations with language and semantics, makes that slightly more difficult. So yeah,
So just to make sure we don't let journalists off the hook, you wish, or your community wishes, they would have seen journalists when they had some victories to broadcast or just to talk about their daily lives, but you were guaranteed to see journalists if they would associate something that might have been happening in Britain with someone that might have been of a certain identity or dress a certain way. Journalists will be swarming through your community when that happens.
Well, that's the thing, yeah. I think, and what led me to my interest in journalism is that within my own community, I saw how much passion and talent and interest that there is in so many different things news and so many different arts. And I think as much as, yes, we should report on some of the things that are happening, there's also power in also reporting the originality and the uniqueness and, you know, the things that make these communities that are really alienated actually very special. And I think the lack of that is what also leads to the alienation of our communities. It's really hard to, you know, we've become so accepting, you know, worldwide as like a society, you know, accepting of people's races, religions, sexual identities. But I think at the same time, there's so many little, you know, disconnections and divides, and I think that is because the media play a role in attaching labels to certain identities. So, yeah, maybe if we could represent nice things as well, you know.
I mean, it's just useful, I think, to say one thing, jumping ahead in a way. And I think this is a really important message to get across, which had come up in all my work and definitely came up in this work. And I think it's a message that kind of plays with kind of the way we as journalists feel about each other. For the people in our community, journalism has a negative impact on their lives, not a positive impact on their lives. And we have this narrative that we do public interest journalism, it is good, therefore you must.
It must be good.
Yeah,
it says public interest.
But it is having, for lots of people and communities, a negative impact on their lives rather than a positive impact on their lives.
Right. What about you, Rhiannon? In your capacity as a citizen, maybe an artist, did you run into journalism?
So I think I'll start with like the personal perspective, like my personal interaction with journalism. And a historical one is I grew up on a council estate, so in social housing in the east of Cardiff. And in the 1990s, the former Welsh Secretary of State came to our community and said that single mothers were getting pregnant to get council housing and that they should have their children taken off them and put into care. The people he was talking about was my family, was my mother, was my neighbours. And 30 years on, that narrative is still plays a massive role in the community. It's like a black cloud that hangs over our neighbourhood. And I think for me, it's really interesting when I think around journalism and how that story was told. It was the first time that our neighbourhood was over the broadsheets across the UK, you know, and actually the impact, of course, that story should be told, but there was never a counter argument to that story. There was never the story about the need for council housing or those strong single mothers who were bringing up their children with a lot of dignity and respect. So there's never that flip side, and I think similar to what Amira is saying, the nuance of the storytelling was left behind. I set up Commonwealth, which is a political theatre company, which is about telling a different story. So in the UK, the word common, if you call someone common, it's a bit of a slur, like you're common, you're poor. But it was to kind of challenge the stories like John Redwood's story and how he spoke about our community, to tell a different story. And we've done that in a very DIY way. So I know it's possible. I know it's possible for journalists to tell that story. Maybe, I think kind of what I'm intrigued about, because I don't know, but is around the representation of journalists and who they are and where they come from and how much they know the stories that they're telling or not telling, and how important that is. Because I know as someone who's from a council estate, from a single parent family, I know the nuances of what it means to come from poverty. And I can tell that story in a different way, maybe, to someone who hasn't experienced those things. So I'm kind of interested in that.
I would say that I'm sure that in this crowd, for many, what you're saying is sort of freeing, because we know a lot of journalists that would like to have that kind of nuance, or sometimes even bring their own identities and their own understanding into stories. And sometimes it's really just the systems that we work in that cut that nuance out. So I think this is the great segue to seeing what you did. And I think before we unpack it a little bit, the best way to understand their work is to look at a video. And this is going to be a short 4-minute video that is a summary of the News for All project. And what's important to note about this video is that it was also made by a member of the community throughout this process. So we're going to look at this, and then I'll go to Rhiannon to tell us a little bit more about how the process was structured. if I click it in the right direction. Okay.
My name is Amira Hayat, and I'm a journalism and media student doing my master's. The News for All sessions were like a massive conversation over a few months to understand what could be done for the media to cater towards a much larger audience. I was a co-facilitator, so Rhiannon and I facilitated these sessions. With that role, we followed the design justice principles, which is basically marginalized communities leading a project that's about marginalized communities. And that was really important to be able to connect with the participants and not make it feel like it was an investigation into them.
I avoid news in general. One, because I don't think it's particularly healthy. I'm not represented, I'm not part of the story. I am the story, but not in a positive way, in a negative way. Would you sit through something that is dehumanizing you, not representing you correctly, misrepresenting you? You wouldn't. You would disengage from it, and it's simple.
The News for All sessions were also really, I'd say, quite unique. And that was because obviously with the involvement of the BBC and with everything that's happened and the way a lot of marginalised communities feel towards, not just BBC, but a lot of mainstream media outlets, they feel a lot of hostility towards them. And that was expressed many times in pretty much every session. It was like, sorry to say, but this is how I feel, blah, blah, blah. And it was really important that they were able to freely express that and that they were comfortable enough to say that, because it was really important for the BBC to learn its position in our lives.
We came up with the idea of journalists in residence, so the journalists would kind of go to these communities and spend more time to get to know the community, really build relationships, so that when they report the stories that they have to report, they're more truthful and they come from a space of honesty instead of just reporting from an outsider's point of view. Another solution that we thought about was kind of verifying with the people that we're talking about before necessarily reporting things that don't represent us well. We also thought about monthly forums. So in our case, this would be a collaboration between the Great Pavilion and, for example, BBC News. We would come together and storytell, share our ideas a couple times a year, just so that there is that connect, so it doesn't feel like such a divide between the news outlets and the communities. You know, we can mix it together, make them connected. I think that would really help with representing these communities.
It was really, really important to have that space to learn that it's not just me who thought that, because I thought that for a long time, but that lots of people in the community are looking for a way to change what's happening. And there's a lot of hope even in this project. Lots of people are like, well, we want to know what happens next. We don't want this project to just end and we don't hear from you guys. We want next steps. So I think it's really important to see that like determination and motivation in the community is great.
We thought it was important to see this before we got talking about how it was made, just so you get a sense of what it looked like. Rhiannon, this didn't look like a focus group we might do in our newsroom. It didn't look like much of the user research that we sometimes do. And there were those words up there when we began community-led design. So I was wondering if you can tell us a bit about what Shirish was saying in the beginning. So who did you talk to? What did you talk about? And most importantly, what are some of the bullet points of the how? How is this put together? And I know you're going to run a workshop in the afternoon. So if you want to learn how to do this kind of research and project, there's a workshop. But Rhiannon will just tell us a little bit about sort of the short form version of how is this put together.
Cool. And me and Amira co-led it, so Amira, if you want to chip in at any point, that would be good. I would say that we started from this design justice theory, And it was very much about bringing this group of people together and really understanding deeply who they were, where they come from, and what they wanted to say about journalism, but also the world around them. And the people in the group, they were a mixture of our neighbors, our friends, wider people we'd worked with before. I mean, one of them, Mohammed, he worked with you. Yeah.
So I think another really important part of the people who participated in this project is that, like Rhiannon said, they all came from so many different backgrounds. But I think the importance of us being facilitators was being able to hold the space with the community, being part of that community, and having contextual understanding of like the history, the background, and the people. And like, I'm just chipping in really quick and adding that I think one amazing thing that I took from the entire project overall is that people, there's so much passion, like rather than people thinking, like I'm just not going to be represented anymore, I'm just going to leave it. There's a lot of hope and willpower to create something that's independent and like still, looking for something or creating something new that is actually what they're looking for.
Yeah. And so we did a session once a month, and we created this 2-hour session that was, it was creative, right? We had a laugh, we had food, we ate together. It was always, like, we were always so surprised that there was so many of the people who just stayed with us. Like, it was a highlight for them to come together and just hang out together. But then within that, we were like doing these kind of creative exercises around who they were as people and where, like I said, where they come from. And that felt really rich as a starting point to really see them and go, okay, this is who we are in this room, and this is what we are moving forward towards. Like, I don't think we could have built a future without really taking stock of what was there in front of us in that moment. And then the other thing around that process was that actually that process began in October, and the backdrop of that process was the Gaza war. There was so much going on in the external environment that was complex. There was a lot of complexity that was being held in that room, and it was a space where people could talk very freely about the things that they were experiencing directly or indirectly, or as a result of the media at that time. So it also felt like a place to share things that were very complicated, actually. And we were very honest with that. And then working with Sirish, we were able to be very transparent around the journey. So step by step, we would do these creative exercises with a focus on the future of journalism and how news could be in service to this community particularly, but then also any stumbling blocks that we were coming up against or anything that was complex for us, we would discuss it collectively and share every detail. We didn't hide anything from anybody, so we would talk quite openly. And I think that really helped us with the basis of trust. There was a lot of trust and a lot of care and a lot of love. And I think one of the takeaways for me from that process was one of the participants at the end, a young girl, said, I felt like this was a genuine exchange, like I learned something from this and I can take some skills with me. So it wasn't just us, it wasn't extractive. It didn't feel extractive at all. It felt really collaborative. Like they were our creators with us, you know?
And I think that what made it collaborative is, if I'm to take out some lessons there, is the fact that you knew the community was a feature of this. It was not. It was intended, and it was where the value was. That Amira was a co-facilitator from that community. That was also important. And you didn't go in and just say, "Okay, welcome. We have 5 questions. Why are you avoiding the BBC?" You let them take as much space as they needed for this to start.
And I would also say there was like a lot of very strong opinions. Like, I think that's one thing is like a lot of the time the community that we come from is deemed as stupid, or then they wouldn't know about that, but actually they know so much. Actually, the most politicized community that I've come across, they have a lot to say, but also that they're quite direct, and there's times where our colleagues from the BBC are in the room and we're holding these very complex, direct conversations, and there's value in everyone meeting and seeing each other as humans, and then like finding that as a starting point.
Yeah.
Just quickly on that as well, I think what's really important about the way Rhiannon and Amira did this and designed it is we did a whole session at the beginning and a whole session at the end where we didn't ask any questions. It was all about the relational stuff and building the relationships. And for some people, they would say, you didn't do any work. And for me, that is the work, because we couldn't have got anything else in between without having done that work at the beginning and the work at the end to create the relationships and to create the trust and be honest with each other. Like, people said some really emotional, personal things, and frankly, those are the things which create relationships and build trust.
Yeah.
Sorry, and
Yeah, go ahead.
just sometimes those sometimes also there was silence and quietness. And, you know, I remember on the third session, a young man whose family are from Gaza speaking for the first time, but also allowing for that, allowing for it to move at that speed and to not expect and to not excavate all of the questions, all of the answers, but just giving space, basically.
Yeah.
And I think, like you said, one of the most valuable and beautiful moments was when we did the iftar with Amira led an iftar for the community, and it was so beautifully profound because it was a real celebration, because long after this project these relationships continue and the ripples of this work is seen and felt and continues to be, and that for me felt like the starting point for the ripples to come.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to maybe, Amira, you have some moments that stood out for you, what people revealed about their relationship to news. We've already seen one member of the community saying, like, how can you watch something that is dehumanizing you? So what other things have you heard in terms of how people relate to journalism and journalists?
Yeah, I mean, like Rhiannon said, a lot of the people in the group were super expressive, and they were very honest and transparent about their opinions and what they engage with and what they disengage with. And there were two women who are actually sisters, and we used to call them the naughties of the group because they loved to chat and they loved to throw in an opinion here and there. But they would always talk about how, you know, the media and journalism has really, really impacted them in such a negative way that they so strongly have disengaged from the media and journalism in general, to the point they were even saying things like, you know, when we asked, you know, how do you feel about journalism? What is a journalist to you? And they literally said, well, I feel like they're liars. Like, we tell them our stories and then they share it, but they share it in a totally different way. And I think that's such an interesting point for journalists to take away, because if people are trusting you with their story and their information, but then you're using it against them in a way, then, you know, how does it feel like you're doing your job? But at the same time, another thing that I took from this, and one of the special moments, was definitely the iftar. As we came to the end of Ramadan and the end of the sessions, we'd go into a session, we'd do some work, and then we'd eat, and, you know, continue a little bit. But for this one, obviously, most of the Muslim community were fasting, and I was able to kind of lead the session in the sense of talking about how special this project was, how unique it was, but then also to talk about how important it is, even from a religious perspective, to come together and eat no matter what background, religion, ethnicity, background, like wherever you're from, we're here together to eat together, and to kind of round off all the sessions in that way was so special. Like, I'll always remember that, and I remember being able to sit with the participants and actually be able to talk about my life and my, you know, my hobbies, my favorite foods. We were trying to guess where each other was from and what their favorite foods and, you know, music and stuff was, and that was a real relationship. I feel like that was the best part. Was I'm still in contact with so many of them now, and I think that's really beautiful. Really beautiful.
Every time I hear stories like this, I feel we're given permission to sort of break what we sometimes sarcastically say, there's people and there's journalists. Like, a journalist can't be people, and I feel I'm given permission as a journalist to actually eat with my fellow humans and just talk about life, and apparently it's possible. So I did want to also put this, because it's heartbreaking to hear how people see us, and I did want to say that one of the things I read from your project is that some people compared journalists to the police. So that's how heartbreaking it can be to understand how we're seen in some communities that we're not doing a good job of talking about. So Shirish, I wanted to turn to you and say, so as a journalist, I think you're among the ones who are used to hearing these kinds of things, but still, what are the takeaways you think for journalists from hearing people talk about what the work means? What has it made you think of, and what do you think we all stand to learn?
Yeah, I mean, so much stuff, but actually not stuff that's necessarily new. Actually, there's a lot of stuff that people have been saying for 25 years or more, but that people haven't necessarily been listening, but we just have to keep on saying it in different ways, but that's fine. But picking up on what Rhiannon said, actually, about they're not stupid, we wrote in the report, marginalized does not equal stupid, it just equals marginalized. And I think and going back to your thing about this is systems of journalism, this is not individual journalists or whatever, this is a systemic problem. People are talked down to. We heard in the community panel yesterday, it's about respect. That's, if you put one word up there, it's just respect. And so in part of that, what we discovered, for example, was that our group is incredibly news literate. So again, there's this narrative in the industry. They just don't understand how incredible our public interest news is. Let's give them a news literacy program so they can understand. And we don't have to change anything we do. And what came out was they understand the centralization of ownership. They understand the motivations of media barons. They understand the lack of diversity in newsrooms. And guess what? That's why they're not engaging with journalism. The news literacy is why. And there's a really good thesis, a really obvious thesis to be made, that marginalized communities are more news literate than the average bear because they are faced with this torrent of kind of, abuse, frankly, a lot of the time. So that's, I think, really important to get that message across. The other thing that came across is I work, my job title says News Innovation Research Fellow, and we're working with BBC News Labs largely. But what I realized was that news innovation tends to focus on outputs, like formats, platforms, is it on TikTok, is it on Instagram, blah, blah, blah. And what we realized was that if it's the wrong story in the wrong way, they don't give a crap if it's on Instagram or TikTok. They're not going to engage with it because it's attacking and harming them. And what they want, the solutions that Elia explained in the film, are all input side innovations. And I say innovations, but in a way they're going back to the basics of journalism. What we'd really love is for people to spend time with us, understand us, speak to us. We can have some accountability with them and then tell our stories. So it's input side innovation rather than output side innovation. And ultimately, I think, going back to the kind of AI thing, it's like, yeah, you can spend a lot of money on AI, but ultimately, what is going to differentiate you in 2, 5, 10 years' time? Is it how you're using AI differently, or is it how you're doing that connection stuff? Because actually, there are going to be lots of things which a machine can do better than a human being. There are some things which a human being can only ever do. A machine will never be able to do. And I sometimes summarize those as connection, collaboration, and care. And so we're going to have to lean into those because those are the things which machines aren't going to be able to do.
Right. And I think part of what you're saying is also, I know you sometimes take an issue with how we define news avoidance, as if something like we put out this great product, this public interest information, and people just don't want it. But what you're saying is sometimes they stay away from it because it's delivered by a system they consider, I'm sorry to say this, but oppressive sometimes.
Yeah, 100%. And it's that, as I always say, if people stop buying Ford cars, Ford doesn't say we have a Ford car avoidance problem. They say, maybe we need to make a better car. It's like journalism cannot continue to be the only industry where the customer is always wrong, right? Maybe they're telling us something. And also, I think, I just want to add one thing to takeaways, which I forgot, which is really super, super important. And this wasn't a planned outcome, but people at the end told us, as a result of working in this way, the way that's been led by Rhiannon and Amira, they felt both more willing and more able to take part in wider civic and democratic life because they saw the possibility of change. And the thing that stops people engaging is they don't see the possibility of change, and suddenly they saw the possibility of change.
I think that in this crowd, and we've heard over the past few days, there's a lot of journalists that would absolutely be on board with this, would love to do this. There's a lot of great engagement specialists, even in this room. So I'm curious, and I'm curious about Rhiannon's perspective, especially coming from the outside. What kind of roles or what kind of skills do you think journalists should learn? Or maybe you could make a pitch directly to the management, who's obviously a problem in this system, that they need to invest in building some capacity for this type of engagement. So what would you make a newsroom do?
I think it's quite a hard question. The first thing I would ask is to maybe have an acknowledgement of how much violence and oppression that these communities have already experienced and are still experiencing, and then to load more stuff onto them, or to be of pressure to them, and to not be in service to them. I would just say, what the hell are you doing, actually? And I would ask them to really think about it from a human perspective. When all else fails, what are the stories you are telling and why? And how, as journalists, can you be in service to people in a way that will benefit their life, while still exploring and sharing complexity and the stories of the world, but really thinking, how can I benefit people and be in service? It's really interesting when we were asking the participants about the journalists that they do like, and how many times they spoke about the journalists in Gaza who were working on the ground to tell stories in such extreme circumstances, and how much they trusted the stories that were coming out from them. And I think that's really telling of, like, actually when you strip it all back, how are you telling stories? In what conditions? And how can you tell a story that is really happening in the ground around you, you know? What do you think, Amira?
No, I think I would probably mention the same thing. I think what's lacking is the historical context and the understanding, because again, another thing that came up in the sessions wasn't that we wanted, for example, a Muslim journalist to represent the Muslim community. That's not what we're looking for. We want someone who is engaged in that community, who has contextual understanding of that community, so that they are not alienating and marginalizing them further through reporting on them. Reporting on communities isn't the problem. It's the way that you do it, the language that you use, the associations that are made. So I think, for me, I feel like a really important part is language, because if it wasn't for the language that was used in the media, we wouldn't have certain labels and stereotypes. So I think that's, probably the two main things I'd look for.
I also wanted to ask you, Amira, I think we've seen in the video some examples of what people would like us to do with them. And like, there are new formats that have been, so yes, new listening better and doing the work better, but they've also proposed new formats of engaging with them. Can you share a bit of what those might be? So if the four of us started a newsroom, what formats would we bring to a community?
I think if we're looking at trying to integrate with communities and stuff, it wouldn't just be trying to hold a space like this, for example, where we could invite lots of people, because I think, again, to a lot of people within these communities, it can feel quite intimidating. But I think like some of the things that came up with talking about monthly forums and things, for example, one of the participants had the idea of either going into schools or going into barbershops and actually hearing the conversations and topics that come about in those spaces. That's a real way to engage with the real life community and lives of those people. I don't think if we were to try and hold a forum formally and call it a forum, I don't think it'd be as inviting to our community. But I feel like something that feels more relatable and also accessible to them, because people don't have time, to go to, it's a luxury to be able to go to different events, things that are separate to their lives. But if the journalists and people working within the media are the ones making the time, that's also what creates the trust and connection between the community and the journalists. So if anything, it's a job for them to go into the communities in the right way with the right intentions of, I want to learn more about you guys and what you do, what your cultures, traditions, why do you feel like this? That would be way more effective.
Which is, as Shirisha's, very old school, right? Like, if you're there, it almost doesn't matter. We'll make it a forum, a dinner, show up in our schools, let's talk. So you can be there in many forums, but be there if you want to be trusted.
We had a really practical one that was amazing. It was like, one of them said, you get like a news app that tells you, a weather app that tells you what the weather's going to look like for the week. His idea was like, imagine if there's a news app that will help you plan your day better. And that was like kind of revelationary to us, because it was like things shift and change so much. So if there's like something that is law that shifts and is going to impact you, or if the benefit system changes and that will impact you, if the road is closed for a specific reason, like how can it be in service to people?
Yeah. That's part of a wider thing. So we did talk about output formats as well, and in a way, to give you a bit of context when we're talking about context, is I work a lot with kind of other kind of community news projects. And we did some training for one of these, in a way for people to be able to tell their own stories, because the barriers to entry are pretty low right now. And I did a risky thing, or like a thing that was kind of, people thought was weird. Like, why would you do that? And so we did an introduction to telling your own stories. And as the second module, we did a whole module on systems thinking, right? And that was, before we got into journalism, we did a module on systems thinking. And you can tell when something's worked because the WhatsApp group just lit up afterwards. And that was, again, going back to change, suddenly they saw how systems work, but also how journalism could make their lives better rather than make their lives worse. And so what that sort of appeared as in this work was people said, like, news is always one thing on one day, totally decontextualized. So why do we tell stories as systems? So for example, to get to the reason, really obvious example, we get stories every day about small boats on the English Channel and quote unquote illegal migrants, but who are very often refugees or asylum seekers, again, talking about the language, washing up on the shore. What we rarely hear about is the bombs being dropped on their heads in Afghanistan and Syria, many of them made in Britain, because that's difficult for the system to talk about when you are seen as part of the state, which is also something that came up. So why don't we have timelines which go backwards, but also forwards, which journalism is very scared of, but actually we know how policies play out. We can make guesses. No one sues the weather app, but they're having a good guess at where this thing could go. So yeah, putting stories in their systemic context was something that really came up.
So speaking of changing systems, you got all these great results. There's a lot of insight from like very simple things, like food is good when you're doing this kind of work, to all these formats you were talking about. What would this project change in how the BBC is doing its journalism? How did the BBC receive the results?
Right, so I have to be in a sense, quite careful when I talk about this. So we wrote a report about this for the BBC. We made the film. The beauty of, the beauty of the work was that we've shown, A, you can get deeper and richer insights into what communities want and need. B, we've created the beautiful relationships with and between that community, which is difficult to quantify, but is enormous, right? We've started to rebuild some trust because we've created accountability. And as we talked about, we've created this willingness and ability to engage in wider democratic and civic life. So for any newsroom, right, those are enormous wins. And if you're a license fee funded public broadcaster, that is your mission, right? So here's the plot twist. So the latest position we have from BBC managers is that we can't publish the report, we can't send it to anyone, even internally, and no BBC staff are allowed to talk about the results of the report. I'm just going to say those are the facts, and I cannot and will not, I guess, lie about those. You'd have to ask those BBC managers why they've made those decisions. None of us are very clear, but I hope in good faith it's just a misunderstanding of the work and the report, but we're still in negotiation to kind of try and figure that out. But obviously you can see from this that the reality is that if they were to maintain that position, that's, counterproductive, obviously, but actually harmful as well to the people and communities and participants involved. So I really hope that is a misunderstanding and we do get a chance to put this out through official channels, because ultimately at the root of this, these are enormous and central questions for the future of journalism and the future of society. And I think those are decisions that should be made with that in mind, and I really hope they can be.
I do just want to let this sink in, because this is a project that starts with trying to learn the things we're not doing well, and then it's at a point where we're learning some of the things we're not doing well, but the system is reluctant to accept the findings. And this is a system that is well regarded by many of us in this room. So I really appreciate the transparency and you being here to talk about this. I don't want to put you too much on the spot if these are things you don't want to talk about, but I'm curious, Rhiannon and Amira, not necessarily what this means to you, but sort of in an ideal world, how would the journalistic system respond to your findings and to this process? What would you like to see? Like, you've created something special here. What would you like to see happen? And then maybe we'll turn to some audience questions.
A little bit of innovation and adaptation and responsiveness wouldn't go amiss. So I think my expectation would be that. But the result of this, to be honest, is not surprising. It's always been the story. I would just wish for more, because I think people deserve better.
I feel like it's a big question, and when you asked, I had like a list of things, but I'll try and like narrow it down. And I think, I'd probably also say like innovation, uniqueness, and like not to be afraid of trying to be slightly different to the way traditional journalism has been and still kind of is. And I think for me, again, I keep bringing up language because I think it's so important, and that's what creates the real impact. So maybe if we can see a switch in the language that's being used and how we use it, and in regards to the visual representation, with the imagery and videos and things like that, I think it's super important. So I'd love to see a change in that.
Thank you. And I hope whatever happens to this project, this doesn't change your mind that journalism is something you will want to do. Because I personally think that we need people like you, Amira, and like the students that were up here before. Otherwise, this profession is in trouble in many ways. So I know lunch is coming up, but since we have about 10 more minutes, I do want to give you a chance to ask some questions. And I think there's microphones coming. We have one here, one here, one here, and please, just my quick request to make sure we're good on time, that you ask a quick question.
Quick question. My question is, I guess, to Amira and Rhiannon. The group that you worked with, how did you find them, and how did you get their commitment?
We recruited, we kind of recruited directly through all the different groups that we know across the city. So we started first in our neighborhood, like the place that you saw on the video is actually the street that I live on. And that's the community center. And within that community center, we have so many different people of all ages. But it was really important for us to also speak to other communities across the city. So we reached out through our networks to the different areas that might feel marginalized because of their location or because of their class or because of their race. And we brought them all together in a central place to get a variety of different voices and experiences.
And I guess the only thing to add to that is, in a way, this absolutely wasn't an attempt to create a representative sample. It was deliberately to work with the most marginalized people. And the relationships which already existed were a feature, not a bug. If you were trying to do a quote-unquote rigorous focus group process, like having sisters in it would have been a bad thing. Or, Amira knowing someone because she worked with him in the coffee would have been a bad thing. But that's actually where you get the richness. And so, yeah, in a way, throwing away those kind of old kind of notions of objectivity, I can't even say the word with a serious face, is part of the design.
Thank you. We have a question up here and then down here. Yeah.
Do you think influencers are a threat to journalism?
Sorry, what was the first section?
Do you think influencers, both on TikTok and Instagram, are a threat to journalism?
I mean, that did not come up in our research, and maybe that's a thing for, ultimately, I think the question is, are the people telling our stories the people that should be telling our stories and we want to be telling stories? That could be a whole bunch of different people. As we talked about, people are doing lots of independent journalism now because they don't see what they want and need from mainstream organizations. So the barriers to entry are much lower than they were 25, 30 years ago when I started, because you can just make videos on your phone. So I don't think we have a judgment on that, but ultimately, quote unquote, the market will decide, right, in some ways.
In Cardiff, where we live, there was a big riot, and it was kind of amazing because there was 20,000 people from the city watching on Facebook that riot unfold, which is very different to the news that was coming out at the time. So I think it's something to watch, right? How people engage with that stuff.
Can I also add, I think the question in relation to influencers as well, and the impact on the news. I think, again, with social media, it's such a revolutionary thing where, especially with the horrifying things happening in Palestine, it's also been really positive in the sense of being able to see how different journalism can be and how it changes how citizens interact and engage with journalism. Being able to see, I mean, they're now being called influencers, but they weren't initially when they were just reporting on what was happening in Palestine. I think that's super powerful. So, yeah.
And I think you can ask Amira during lunch about how she sort of built a community on Instagram reading poetry. So obviously there is a serious conversation to be had there. I think we had a question here and then up there. And
thank you so much. As a recovering BBC correspondent, I want to say there are obviously some really deep systemic problems that you've tried to address and got cut off in the process. But I wonder, are there guidelines for journalists, or did you try to get on board single journalists? Because I think there is a lot of goodwill, but there's also a lot of mistakes that we make without even being aware of it. Like, we were talking about this with Christian yesterday. For example, not showing your copy to the people you interviewed beforehand because we consider them as, politicians, and we don't want to give them the right to change our copy. So I wonder how that process went.
Yeah. I mean, it's difficult because in this process, we actually kept it very deliberately, in a way, closed because it was trying out for the first time, and there's a lot of risk. Because if you bring in people who sort of don't get it, the danger is real. And actually, on that, just as one example, we had originally planned to hold one of the sessions in the BBC in Cardiff, because that's what you would normally do, right? That's how you build relationships. They can do their little video on the green screen, being a newsreader. And then it very quickly became clear to us, particularly because of the context that was happening around, that wouldn't be the right thing for them or probably the BBC. So it's thinking about those things. But on your thing about the copy, it's a really good example, I think. So I think a lot of this is, in a way, we have lots of rules in journalism, but which aren't rules. So I saw something on a Slack channel for freelance journalists, and someone had asked about, do you give copy approval? And some quite famous white guy posted a thing, I've done a guide, right? I've done a guide. They've always done a guide. He said, I've done a guide. And so the first thing was, which was horrible, was no Western journalist worth their salt would give copy approval to anyone. And I was like, so much to unpack in there. No Western journalists? Were you saying like non-Western journalists are shitty? Well, you are saying non-Western journalists are shitty journalists, but probably don't. And then, but why, when trust is the existential problem we are facing, why would you not check that you've reflected someone accurately and fairly with them? And if we're not, what are we scared of? So I guess it's throwing away those rules, which are rules made by a system which was even less diverse and inclusive than it is now, and it's very undiverse and uninclusive now.
Let's take one more, and then we'll close.
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for everything you have been said. You have gone to the roots of the problem, actually, that no one dared to say. My question, because I already worked also as a social civil activist, also a journalist, but it was separate. But the most question that we get every time we do some initiative is, we need to see practical move later. And you also mentioned that because they always tell you, like, please tell us how it's going to happen, how are we going to see a practical change. How do you respond to this, especially in your project?
Well, I mean, it's a really, really good point, actually. So in the process, actually, what we realized was, at the beginning of every session, after the first session, I would give a report back on who I talked to in the BBC and other news organizations. Say, oh, they're really excited by this. This is what they're going to do. They're really engaging with it. So again, going back to that thing of seeing change and that building buy-in, that was a really super important learning to show that process of change. And we worked really, really hard to build buy-in with the whole organization. Because I said at the beginning of this project, 50% of the work is doing the work, 50% is building buy-in with organizations that frankly don't want to change. We know that. And it's difficult because, the reality is that in the report, the inside front cover is a glowing endorsement from Deborah Turness, who is the CEO of BBC News. And so I don't know what we could have done to build more buy-in and show the support for the work and still, in a way, have the position we're in now. But I think, in a way, like what it's like, we will carry on doing the work, right? We'll carry on working together. Maybe, I'm not going to say that's enough, but we know we can do things better by doing things differently, and we come here, and hopefully, our wish, I'm going back to, I don't think we are experts. There are people doing incredible work already here, but the more people who are doing incredible work like this, the better, I think.
So before we close, I just wanted to ask Amira and Rhiannon if you had one final takeaway thought to share with us. If there's anything that hasn't been said or that you want to stress.
I think the only thing that I would want to say as like an end-off thing is that because I say that I'm an activist, I have to mention people like Malcolm X and the Black Panthers, and like they are people who I'm super inspired by and who I think are worth being represented at the root of our communities and what they believe in, what their values are. And I think, I just would say that the power is within the people in the communities. So go towards that.
I would also just say that look outside of journalism for inspiration. Like, I'm just thinking about processes or ways of working, this idea of collaboration or co-production or co-creation, like the ethics that exist, and really steal from it, actually. Steal from it and apply it to your work, because I think there's some really interesting ways of working with people, not working against them or, extracting from them.
So a lot of the conversations you've heard here are about the future of journalism using big data sets and how we can do that better. This was about going human scale. So you've had the big scale, now you've had the human scale. I want to thank IMED for hosting this conversation. Thank you, Amira. Thank you, Rhiannon. Thank you, Shirish. And thank you all for being here.